Welcome to Headstrong. My name is Louis and I host this podcast. On Headstrong, I invite guests on to talk about their vulnerabilities, to show it as a strength. And today I'm joined by someone who I've been communicating with for a very, very long time, Jake. Thank you for coming on to Headstrong.
Thank you for finally having me.
God, how long has it been?
I honestly think it's been about 6 months. We've been going back and forth, maybe longer. But you've been quite busy in the interim, so.
Well, I've been busy, and I would say that for many potential strengths I have, one of my key weaknesses is communication. On WhatsApp.
The WhatsApps do sit there.
They do.
Sometime. There was a point where I was sort of nudging you every few days just to see, but I'm the same, so.
But we're here.
No problem.
We're chatting right now. It's the end of January, and I wanted to talk about something when I was prepping for this episode, notably about Hampstead Heath. I don't know if you've seen it.
Do you know, so I wondered this morning as I left my house if we were going to talk about that.
Yeah, so for context, so yesterday, which was the 29th of January, I read that a legal challenge against rules allowing trans people to use the single-sex facilities at Hampstead Heath's swimming ponds will not proceed at the High Court. Now, that is very much on a community level in being at Hampstead Heath. But what does that sort of dismissal mean to both you and indeed the wider community?
So oddly, actually, my wife was trying to explain this to me yesterday and the kids were there and I wasn't really listening to exactly what had happened, but I think it was that this people had put forward a motion that there would be a banning of trans people within those spaces on Hampstead Heath for the women's pond, I think it is.
Yes.
And that was knocked back by the courts, and the courts said they weren't going to entertain it. And they also had 38,000 signatures of people saying that they wanted to be supportive of trans people and just leave us alone and everyone's there for a swim and it's supposed to be about health and community and let's not make a big deal of this. It's obviously a small victory or maybe a big victory, but at the moment it's very much a kind of from 1 week to the next. It's a good court case, great, and then it's a bad court case. And it's very much at the moment, we are on tenterhooks and have been now since pretty much since sort of last April, May, when the Supreme Court ruling came out, redefining what a woman means according to the Equality Act. And then obviously the EHRC put out this really extreme, the most extreme possible reaction to that ruling. And since then, trans people have been in this very, very worrying space of, are we going to be able to go to the toilet? Are we going to be able to, use a changing room? Are we going to be able to go to the gym? So this is kind of where we're at. So these victories like yesterday, great, but we're just waiting for next week when it's going to be another shit show, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, as you say there, so it was a charity that put forward this motion that is dismissive of the trans community. And as you say there, it was 38,000 people who took part in this 2-month consultation. And from those stats, it was over 90% of people were supportive of it. And that is fascinating to me because when a minority of people are fighting something like this so relentlessly, it affects the community and then the feelings of frustration and this sort of pursuit of narrative. What does it make you feel on that personal level?
Honestly, very well in the UK, we've had about 10 years now of fairly rampant, relentless transphobia. In 2015, we had this kind of lull where everything, the media switched, everything felt for the first time in my lifetime, I think in most trans people's lifetimes, like things were getting a lot more positive. That year we had the Danish Girl, which I'd consulted on and had a small part in. We had Laverne Cox coming out on she was on the cover of Time magazine. Caitlyn Jenner, before we realised was a bit shady, was on the cover of Vanity Fair and came out to this huge fanfare and so much support. We had Boy Meets Girl on BBC. There was this reel that was called The Transgender Tipping Point, and everyone thought, finally, we're going to be okay, we're going to be supported, we're going to be accepted. We'd won the human rights charge, and then the Equalities Act came up for review, and all of a sudden it felt like there was this massive backlash. And the people who didn't like us very much, who felt maybe we'd been given a little bit too much freedom and rights, kind of lashed back. And unfortunately, for the last 10 years, the media got on board. There were literally years where the Sunday Times was pumping out 3 or 4 or 5 anti-trans articles every single Sunday. We would see hundreds in a year about a group of people that's, I think we're about 0.4% of the global population. And when you open up your paper and all you're seeing is trans, this feels a lot more than a sort of curious, a slight fascination. This is an obsession with trans people. So it's very hard not to feel personally attacked. And with all of these things that come out, like possibly not being able to use a men's toilet if this guidance goes through, my wife Hannah, who's also trans, not being able to use a women's toilet. What do we do? How do we take our kids to the loo? It's hard to feel that this isn't very personal, although I know, I've never been to Hampstead Heath. So, maybe I'll go anyway.
Maybe now's the time to go.
Yeah, I know, before it gets any worse. So yeah, it feels very personal, and it feels honestly exhausting, and just leave us alone.
What I find really interesting, I briefly mentioned it there, but evidence clearly suggests that these voices that are kicking up so much fuss are a minority in themselves as well. And so does it frustrate you that such a small group of people, single-minded people, can make such loud noise and dominate conversation?
Absolutely. I mean, we're seeing it all around. We're seeing businesses change their policies because of a single person who's complaining about a single trans person. And it's this disproportionate reactions that we're getting because at the moment, honestly, companies are scared. They're scared because of this legislation that possibly is going to happen, possibly not. Everyone's on the back foot. No one knows quite what's going to happen. And unfortunately, a lot of companies are reacting with a knee-jerk reaction and banning people and making these decisions that shouldn't really happen. If you go back 100 years when people of colour were fighting for their rights and just to be able to use the same bathroom as a white person, and there would have been those small minorities of white people who said, oh no, it would upset me to have to share this bathroom space with a person of colour, a black person, and luckily we pushed forward through that. And we came to the understanding and recognition that that was purely discrimination and bigotry, and that those voices that were rooted in division and hate and discrimination should not be the ones that overrode the ones that were saying, let's all go to the loo together, for God's sake. It always comes back to toilets, Louis, honestly. It's always about the toilet. Yeah. And in the 80s, it was about people protesting because they didn't want gay men in their toilets, because, there was this whole stigma around gay men, and the writings then of how people were writing about gay men is the same as they're now writing about trans people. It's lots of fear-mongering, lots of negativity, lots of division, and honestly, a lot of fabrication.
I think you're quite right about fabrication. I think what it boils down to, and we'll talk about it in due course, is education and understanding. I mean, I would be guilty of the ignorant side of it, in the sense that it's difficult for people to assume what is right and wrong, but it's simply because there are not enough, there's not enough information that's being relayed in the general media and places of, information outlets.
Yeah.
Where do you get your information? It's not there. Ultimately, people today are lazy.
Yeah.
They need to be spoon-fed it, but no one seems to be willing to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it has been really difficult for the last 10 years because we have seen a very gradual, well, in fact, not even that gradual, but a sort of absolute silencing of trans voices. And, you read in the paper about trans kids or trans women or barely trans men, because we're almost invisible. But, you read all this negativity, a lot of fabrication, a lot of fear-mongering, a lot of non-issues, but you're never hearing a trans balance to that. Well, this is my experience, this is. And, obviously we've got wonderful people like Lorraine Kelly, who is fantastic and a huge trans advocate. And she has Hannah and I, and she has other trans people on, and does her very best on her platform to give us a voice. And then we get so much positivity. People say, I'd never met a trans person before. And, seeing you two and the other people, the very small pockets of people that are allowed onto television, allowed to have a voice, be it on a podcast or the radio. And it does change people's minds because, we are such a small minority. I think it's still true that about 89% of people have not knowingly met someone transgender. So if you haven't met one of us, of course you're going to believe what you're reading in the rags every single day. Bad, 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 bad. Well, trans people must be bad because you're just not seeing a balance. So it's really important, as you say, that people are helped, because no one's going to go and research trans people, because why on earth should they? We've all got our issues, we've all got our problems, we're all struggling to pay the bills and just get by. But I think it has to come to a point where the balance slightly tips and we at least start hearing from all the trans voices that are out there, as parents, as grandmothers, as teachers, as nurses, as we are everywhere in life, and we are honestly not to be feared.
Absolutely. There are, as you briefly touched on, global challenges facing the global trans community, but I want to bring it down to a daily perspective.
Mm-hmm.
A day in London, walking around here, it's Friday today. What are some of your basic human interaction challenges that you face as a trans man, even still today?
Well, you see, for me, it's different to, I think, most trans people, certainly most trans women, because obviously, you know, I hate the word pass, but I pass, you know, walking down the street, no one knows I'm trans. In fact, when I have come out as trans, and people have quite often not believed me, and it's made for quite an awkward, you know, no, you're not, of course you're not. I mean, you don't look trans. And so for me, my daily interactions are usually fairly simple, but obviously I hear transphobia. I hear people say some silly things about, you know, well, obviously trans women are all predators and, you know, trans kids don't exist. And you hear it because it's out there, because people are reading about it. It's that water cooler moment. That's it. And so that is something that I hear. But realistically, compared to the experience I think that my wife has, and compared to the experience that a lot of transgender women have, particularly trans women of colour, it's a very, very different prospect of, you know, especially if they don't necessarily pass completely, or if they have a slightly deeper voice. You know, I think they're getting a lot of discrimination. You know, I've heard of a lot of stories of friends of ours being dragged out of toilets or being challenged in changing rooms, being misgendered, you know, called sir intentionally. So honestly, I think I am very lucky in that I have a lot of privilege because I'm white, you know, I'm middle class. I present as a man, as any other man. My experience is certainly not indicative of the experience of most trans people, I think, out there at the moment, which is pretty tough.
When you overhear transphobia, which is so clearly part of a lot of culture in a way, it's still very much present. How do you personally deal with that when you overhear it? Are there some battles that are worth fighting and some that are not in those sort of daily interactions? Do you know what I mean?
Of course. I mean, I will, obviously, you know, when it is safe to do so, which it usually is, I'll kind of challenge and I might out myself and say, you know, but I'm trans, and people are normally shocked. And again, usually it is ignorance. It's not born normally from malice or hate. It's born from ignorance. They don't know any better. They're only believing what they've been told. And, you know, the trans women that they've seen in the papers will have been, excuse me, will have been caricaturized, will have been badly represented. And so this is what they've got to go on. But if I'm with Hannah, and quite often this has happened, you know, we'll be on the tube, and Hannah's got quite a deep voice. You know, she was in the military, in the army as an officer for 10 years, and so never went through a lot of the voice training that a lot of trans women do. So she's still got that very deep voice. People hear it, people turn, people stare, and a few times, you know, people have said very loud, "Oh, that's a tranny," or "That's a transsexual," and I'll flare up because that's my wife you're talking about. Firstly, don't talk about her, you know, just as you wouldn't if she were differently abled, or if she were black, or if she were, you just don't talk about other people in a derogatory way, but particularly when it's so dehumanizing and reducing Hannah to a sort of an it, that's what they've read about, you know, it's one of them. And people, unfortunately, because they know that a lot of the media and a lot of the government and a lot of the people out there have presented themselves as to be non-supportive of trans women and trans people, people feel emboldened. People think it's okay. And it's not okay. And I've stood up and I've had arguments, and Hannah's eventually pulled me away because Hannah does not like that sort of confrontation. But, you know, I think you do it if it were your wife.
Of course.
There has to be a point where we start standing up for ourselves. It would never, you know, I'm not a violent person. I would never want anything like that to happen. But, you know, bearing in mind that Hannah now faces taking our two small daughters to a toilet and being potentially verbally abused or challenged or shouted at or thrown out, you know, all of which has happened to people that we know. And that's our biggest fear now, that it happens in front of our kids who are 3 and 5. And
who are starting to become, you know, conscious and self-aware and understanding of situations and things like that. Do you have, I mean, for the trans community, but notably yourself and Hannah then, have you discussed processes, or, you know, if this happens, this is, you know, this is my way of coping with it, your coping mechanisms on that daily sort of process? Or is each one, any encounter, I guess, suppose they can also be on a scale of how severe it can be, but do you have a sort of a tool book, so to speak, with which you challenge and communicate like this? Do you know what I mean?
I do, but no, I mean, not necessarily. There are ways we sort of, you know, I think everyone at the moment is really trying to survive, to get around things. You know, there are a lot of trans people now that just use the disabled toilet just to avoid those types of interactions, which, you know, you can get a radar key on Amazon for about £2 or £3, and then you can use those toilets, which, you know, everyone's saying use the third space. You know, we've actually been told in different government guidelines and different, releases that we should be using the disabled toilets or the third space. But no trans person wants to take that space from someone who really needs it, someone who is, genuinely entitled to be using those spaces. So again, we're put in a very difficult position of, we can get our radar key, we can go in there, we can avoid being with any other people, in that space. But then what if someone is outside really needing that, and we're taking it when we are able-bodied and we don't need that? So, either way, we're put in a difficult position. And I think, luckily there are lots of support groups for trans people. And we always try and tell our, followers and friends, find that support network, because a lot of people are, mental health within the trans community has absolutely plummeted. And, people, it's not even the sort of day-to-day of feeling anxious every time you go into a toilet, which is just so ridiculous. Or, wondering if you're going to be misgendered, or wondering if someone's going to say something about, wondering if you're going to get, attacked, all of which is happening much more frequently. But also the sort of ramifications of how it feels to be constantly derided and put down and questioned and mistrusted, and to have people say the most horrific things about you. Hannah and I get called groomers online, pedos, groomers, you're transing kids, keep your disgusting agenda to yourself, all of these things, which that's what really begins to erode at you. And becomes really tough, honestly, to deal with on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. So that leads me on well, because, there is attrition, daily for you, Hannah, but, the entire trans community with such transphobia that exists. How do you cope with your mental health, and what do you do specifically to preserve and block out, but also train and look after? Because it's not a matter of blocking out. There's only so much blocking out you can do, because you still need to look after yourself.
Yeah.
So what is it that you do on the daily that helps you?
Honestly, I think, I throw myself into my kids. Thank God we've got these two beautiful, happy, sweet, nonsensical, silly little girls who are just fantastic. And I realize, the minute I pick them up from school, there is just joy, and it does sort of wipe it all away, because I can sit and look at my phone, and it's just this slew of horrors, a lot of which I just block and delete. I don't ever respond. It's completely pointless to respond to a troll. Don't bother. Block, delete.
No one's ever won in that situation.
No, absolutely not. And
the troll wins.
If anything, you're giving them a thrill, because they're sad little people sitting behind a keyboard, and if you answer, they feel vindicated, and they've got someone to fuel that fire. So block and delete. Never read the comments, because again, you're never going to get any joy that way. And then, throw ourselves into family life, and that's, going for walks in the park, seeing the kids on their scooters, going away for weekends, spending time with family, spending time with friends, and just trying to sort of block out that noise. Because for Hannah and I as well, we've done a lot of public speaking over the years. We train companies and do trans inclusion and LGBT inclusion training. So that's something that we've done for years. And so we're constantly within that sphere and within that world. And it becomes, there are moments when it's exhausting, but by the same token, we're also really, really lucky that we have that platform, that we have that voice, because there are lots and lots of minorities and marginalized people that would kill for the voice that we have. So, it's just, we're there for each other. If it's a particularly difficult day, then we pick each other up, and we, make sure those hugs are even longer. And, we make sure that every time one of our little monkeys, even when it's 8 o'clock and they're only doing it because they don't want to go to bed, every time they say, "Can I have another hug?" we make sure we give them that hug.
Absolutely. So how do you protect yourself emotionally when you need to be visible? Do you know what I mean? Because yes, you have this platform and you are a role model to so many, notably such a community, but you're also a spokesperson. But there is the human element of it. It's, like anyone in the public eye, you are a version of yourself in the public eye. But at the end of the day, when the front door closes, you're yourself, and you need to look after those emotions. Is there anything specifically that you do? Family and that tight-knit community is so essential, and physical love like that. But is there anything else that you do to help look after number one?
It really is just that, we've got our little things that we do, Hannah and I, watch a bit of Dragon's Den, get a Nando's, but it is amazing how healing that is when you're feeling disconnected, and, she's off working and I'm at home writing, and then, we just get together at that end of the day and can just sit and eat a chicken wing and watch some, Deborah Mead and Putting the World to Rights on telly, it really does make a big difference. I think, and I hate to say this, but I think we've got quite hardened to it. Some of the things that I will tell other people have been, we've had death threats against the kids. We've had people on Instagram saying, death to your children. I mean, that just, and at the time that horrified me. We reported it to Instagram and we were told it didn't go against community guidelines.
Well,
we've all been
barbaric.
There. We've all been, yeah.
I would love to see these guidelines.
Yeah, right.
Who's written these?
At this point, I wouldn't even ask. But yeah, so that was one of the tougher moments. But we're so hardened to it. Being called a groomer. It's not just sort of once. It's probably realistically 60 to 100 times a week we're called groomers or pedos, or pushing our trans agenda or trying to trans kids, and the whole thing that's just nonsensical. We were those young people. I knew I was trans when I was 3 years old. I know what it's like. It's an incredibly tough life, and if that, I would be very glad if my children didn't have to go through that. There is no way, we've been accused of that we're going to make our kids transgender, which obviously you can't do, but there's all these things that we have to go through. But we have been so used to it, I think, now that we really can just block it out. And Hannah and I know, and this is again something that I think kind of helps us, we know it's not really about us. We know that largely these people who are sending this hate are not happy with themselves. And I know this sort of, it's a bit of mental gymnastics and it's a bit of kind of forgiving them their hatred. But I know that happy people aren't sitting at home writing awful comments to us. Happy people are off living their lives. These are inherently miserable people who are unhappy for whatever reason. Maybe they're trans, maybe they're closeted gay, maybe they're just bored. Whatever it is, I think, it's easier to sort of feel a bit sorry for them and just block them and shut the door on them than really let it eat away at us. Because honestly, it would kill us if we did.
It takes someone so strong-willed, headstrong, in fact, to be able to do that, for which I'm incredibly admirable of. Family is so evidently important to you, Hannah being such a rock and vice versa. I think that is so beautiful to be able to have that. Not everyone is fortunate enough to be in that situation and position. But let's talk about married life specifically. How has married life influenced that sort of sense of safety? And then talking about children and everyone wants to be the right parent, the perfect parent, but what is that nowadays with
quite a big story
and...
there, Louis. Quite a big question there, Louis.
No, exactly. That's what I mean. So what I'm interested in talking about is, parenthood and how you and Hannah approached parenthood first and foremost as parents, because everyone has to have that conversation and everyone always goes, I'm going to be the best parent ever. But then actually, what does that actually look like? Especially when you have these even greater challenges faced to you, not just, name calling at school for anyone or whatever it is, it's like you're dealing with far greater issues that can involve both the children and parents. So how did you kind of go about approaching parenthood before you kind of committed to having children?
Yeah. I mean, I never thought that I would marry. I grew up, as I say, I knew I was different. I knew I was a boy from age 3. I grew up in a very conservative household, so there was no external influence. There was no, I was not influenced by the internet. There was no internet back then. I was not influenced in any way. I was trans. I was born trans. That's just who I am. In a world where it wasn't accepted, it wasn't talked about. I didn't know what it was. All I knew was that I felt like a little boy trapped in a girl's body, and that was all I was able to say. And so growing up, because I felt so alone, I felt like a freak, I felt that I was the only person, the only little kid like that. I never saw happiness in my future. I came from a really nice home, loving parents, but they didn't have a clue what was wrong with their child, why their little girl, didn't like dresses and sort of kicked back on all that. And so my life, and I went through alcoholism and drug abuse and all of those things when I was really trying to sort of forget about it in my late teens and early 20s and really fight this gnawing at me that I knew I had to address because I only transitioned when I was 28 years old. And so for me, because life had been so dark, I never thought that I was going to be loved. I never thought that I was going to marry or have kids. All of those things seemed far too removed from my experience. And I thought, who was ever going to want someone like me, you know? And so when I finally transitioned, I'd kind of resigned myself to being alone. And, you know, luckily my mother stood by my side. My father died when I was 18, but she always made me feel like she loved me and that she was there for me. And it was only about 6 years into transition. I was single. I dated a few people, but I was single, and I thought, all my life, you know, I'd worked with kids all my life. I've worked in schools, and I've worked as a nanny. I really get on with kids, and so I thought being a parent is something so special, so sacred, such an amazing thing. And a lot of my friends were starting to have kids, and so I thought, you know what, I'm going to do whatever I can to give myself even a tiny glimmer of hope of that. So I went through the fairly difficult process of having eggs harvested, which was awful and emasculating and nothing I would want to repeat. But I ended up with, I chose a donor because they said if you have them fertilized, then you're going to have, much more chance of them becoming babies. And so I did. I ended up with 5 little embryos on ice. That's a very sort of abridged...
the scientific term.
Yeah, very abridged, 5 embryos on ice. And then they ended up in this little petri dish. And that was that. And I sort of forgot about them, but I knew that I'd given myself a tiny chance of maybe one day being a dad. As I said, I was so single at that point and sort of finding my feet. And when I met Hannah a couple of years after that, one of the first conversations we had, I said, she'd never dated before because she wasn't comfortable in herself. So I was her first ever date. And a week before her first ever date, Anna's, I spoke to her on the phone. I said, look, I have always wanted to be a parent and I'm looking for marriage and kids at this point in my life. This was before we'd ever met.
Going in on halves
Yeah,
then.
right? And I said, you know what?
But
why waste our time?
Be honest.
Imagine if she'd said 6 months in, actually, kids aren't for me. That would have been a painful, awful. So I said to her first conversation, is that for you? And she sort of very nervously kind of went, I'd be open to that. And I was like, great, well then let's meet. And we had a first date that lasted 11 hours.
Where was this?
This was at Waterloo. We were all around Waterloo, South Bank.
Yeah.
Had
Beautiful.
our first kiss in the BFI where I've screened so many of my films. So it kind of felt like coming home. And we just clicked. And after that, we were inseparable. And after a year and a half, she actually decided to leave the army just before she made major, to leave the army and come and move to London and be with me. We married in 2018 and had this beautiful wedding where, all our family and friends were there. And it actually went viral across all the newspapers, all across the UK. But we also ended up in Australia and India and, because people had never seen a trans couple getting married before. It was like really...
Love it.
Anyway, a very, very, very long way to get to. We always knew we were going to be parents because I'd basically decided that's what was happening. But we knew we had to find a surrogate to help us. And so for us, every step was planned. Every step had to be planned. There was no like a quickie on a Saturday night and, oh, look, for us, we had to find someone who we clicked with who would do this for us. Find someone who wanted to work with a trans couple, which was no small feat, given the climate. And this amazing pediatric nurse from Belfast actually approached us after we'd been on Lorraine one morning talking about our quest to become parents. And she said, I followed your story for years. I would love to help you guys be parents. And so, when we met Laura, it was amazing. We clicked on every level. When you're going to surrogacy, you've got to talk about things like what you would do if the baby died, if there was something wrong with the baby during, gestation. What would you do if we died whilst the baby was in gestation? All of these different things. We had to write our wills. At this sort of very young age, you're thinking about what happens if we die. Where does our baby go? So it was a very... I guess, really kind of brought home what we were doing. We were bringing a new life into the world in a way that I guess a lot of parents don't necessarily have to think of that gravitas. Anyway, she got pregnant the first time and we were it was the most incredible. It was the easiest part of, I think, anything we've ever done was her getting pregnant. She was fantastic. And she had a very easy pregnancy, bar the last month when the pandemic came in. But we'd had so much time to talk about how we would raise them, what school they would go to, French school, how they would, how we would do things, our outlook, what, where our priorities were, all of these things. And so, for us, being parents was so meticulously planned before it happened. And now we've got these 2 beautiful, funny, sweet, bouncy, bubbly, nutty kids that honestly we couldn't be more proud of. And, we do all the usual things like, remember your manners and remember, they're very, very sociable because they have met so many different people. They can't ride a bike, but they're very good at like having these quite adult conversations.
Yeah.
So it's been great. So it was a very, very long answer.
No, it's brilliant. I was going to say that you talk so eloquently, and it's really great that you're able to recall and retell so many aspects of your story with passion and meaning, because that's what people need more of. It's probably why you're a filmmaker.
Well,
but I'd love to talk to you about how you talk to your children about identity and self-worth, because I can almost guarantee that there will be ignorant people that assume that if your parents are trans, then they want to raise their children as trans, which is ludicrous, right? And this is where the lack of education and assumptions all come into it.
Yeah.
But how do you approach, what is the reality of approaching raising children as trans parents, talking about identity and self-worth? Because you're in the most perfect place to talk about education of children, because you are the one that gets to do it.
Yes. We, so of course we're not going to raise our kids trans, because you can't, just like you can't raise a kid gay because you're born that way or you're not. Sorry, I completely blanked on the question there. What was the question?
Well, it's talking about...
Oh yes, no, I'm back. Sorry,
Yeah.
sorry.
That's all right.
I was, yeah. So for us, we will of course explain to them exactly where they came from when it's... In fact, Millie already knows. In fact, they both know that they came from Auntie Laura's tummy. So they know that. So at some point, they've asked, why did we not come from Mummy's tummy? And we've said, well, Mummy's tummy didn't work like that. And they absolutely accept that, because kids accept.
Yeah.
So long as you don't make it weird or stigmatized or difficult, then a child just accepts, just like a child who's born of, a single mother or two mothers or adopted or fostered. If you make a kid feel like they are there because they're there out of love and acceptance, and, then a child will be happy with that. So they know they came from their Auntie Laura's tummy. We already explained to them all about different people, that there are people who are differently able, that there are people who have different coloured skin, that there are people who follow different religions. They know all of that. We have our friends over quite often who are a gay male couple, or we have our lesbian friends over. They do not falter, because why on earth? It's so normal. Yes, two mummies. Yes, two daddies. The only slight issue they had with the two daddies was, where's the mummy? But in a very sweet, because
it comes from a place of innocence.
Absolutely, not
not
like, where's the mummy? But just, there's no mummy, but there's two daddies, and now that's great. And they're so used to, all of our friends. So we've done it in we don't want to ram anything down their throat. We want them to come and ask us things, but we make sure that everyone they are exposed to and everyone they're around is kind and is open-minded and is tolerant, and not even tolerant. We shouldn't be tolerating people, accepting people. Yeah. And so that's who they are. And I went to Palm Springs a couple of months ago and stayed in the Trixie Motel, which is the hotel owned by Trixie Motel, the big drag queen. And Millie was fascinated by what drag queens were. And, so they're boys, but they like to dress as girls. She loved that. Yeah. And, she's got lots of friends at school who are boys who also like to dress as girls, because, that's nursery and kids like to wear sparkly shoes and dresses. And so, for her, it is all absolutely normal. And when she starts asking more questions, we will explain a bit more, and we'll probably explain, Daddy was always a boy, but was born in a body that didn't match his head and how he felt. And so he changed that. And that was the same for Mummy. And they'll probably go, righto, can we watch Bluey now? And that will be that, because that's how it should be.
Yeah, absolutely. What about from that educational level then? Because your children are at that age now, we're talking about nursery there. And then we are starting to look at the education of the country, and what that looks like. You're in a position with your young children. What does that currently look like? Because obviously I wouldn't know anything about what schools are like now, about the education of the trans community, transphobia, and education like that. Where is it at the moment? What does that look like in schools?
Unfortunately, there's been a lot of rollback, and that started happening under the last government, where a lot of that was sort of pulled back. We've talked about a sort of return to Section 28, and obviously there was no teaching about LGBTQ identities in schools or universities or any educational setting whatsoever back in the sort of dark days of the 80s. And At the moment, I think it's still there. You know, for instance, our daughter's school the other day had a Pride Day,
Amazing.
which was good. You know, over summer, very sweetly, the nursery did a Pride march to the Common, and you know they all marched out with their little flags in there, and that was all very sweet. I know that there are a lot of parents that probably would have an issue with that. Probably not where we're from, because it's a fairly integrated and mixed part of the world, in London and so on. But I know that a lot of parents are, because of what they're reading and what they're taught, scared of this influence making their kids gay, making their kids trans.
Yeah.
So there is a bit of a pushback against that, just like in the US, where we're seeing books being banned and books being burned and all of these things. Yeah. So I think at the moment it's still being taught in schools, and I think hopefully it's positive. But I know that it feels like there's this constant fight towards progress, and as soon as it feels like we're getting a little bit too far, then that keeps getting yanked back.
Yeah, it's like it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, round in a circle, hopping around. No, everything.
Yeah.
There is quite literally no route. But it's really interesting you say that about parents specifically, because it's like we talked about at the beginning. It's always a minority of people or group that kick up the fuss. But then I think about when I was at school, and when I was in year 7 or 8. We were told to read Lord of the Flies, for example. And I know that that's got nothing to do with anything that we're talking about, but you talk about that book and it's all about aggression and survival of the fittest and what that teaches kids, and like, oh yeah, let's go out to the playground and be like that. It's like you can draw issues in absolutely any part of the education program, but the whole purpose of education is the freedom of information and the education to showcase to everybody, this is what the world you're being brought into, not, oh, this is the world, but don't worry about that part. I just don't understand it. How ignorance can exist on such a obscene level.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is why there are parents, I think probably more in the US than here, who just decide they don't want to deal with any of that and they homeschool their kids because they don't want any of that.
I just think that's mad
well,
as
of course, because then you end up with these very sheltered kids who, unfortunately, will then go on to have exactly the same viewpoints as their parents, unless, of course, they break away from that, and as you hear happening. But there is a real, I think the more we've pushed back against, LGBT, and there really is this push across the world. A lot of the sort of previous D&I groups that we used to speak to and work with and so on have now, it's not even it's a cultural thing, but it's also by name. DEI, diversity and inclusion, has now been wiped. And it's now people and culture quite often. We're finding that, these groups have almost had their sort of identity reshuffled for it to be more palatable. And that's what's happening across the board, whatever works. And obviously a lot of it is people fighting just to sort of remain in those roles where they can still make the positive change without getting wiped out. But when you're literally changing the names, diversity, inclusion, equality, those should be great things that we are all working towards. But so many people are so scared of it. It's like the word woke, which has become so negative. To me, all woke means is to be accepting, to be kind, to be, aware of differences, to be respectful. But, there are people literally writing books, no names mentioned, about, the end of woke and cheering about the end, wokeism is dead. And which, to me, if you don't like the word, fine, then let's just call it progress and kindness, because that's essentially what it is.
Well, I think that's really interesting, the word woke, actually, because there's almost 2 definitions.
Yeah.
There's the real version of what woke is, and then people who like to use woke for basically trying to insult someone, right? But you're absolutely right. It's fascinating because it's such a... I can imagine, being in lower 6th nowadays, that must be a thrown around word, when actually there's a complete lack of understanding of what the real, definition actually is.
Yeah.
Which is quite interesting. Being part of the trans community is, and has made you so resilient, headstrong, empowered, firm in your beliefs. But Headstrong, this podcast, is also about vulnerability as a strength. Given that you have to be so headstrong and open and showcase that you're the role model, do you find showcasing vulnerability challenging still, whilst also trying to be this pillar of strength?
I mean, again, bearing in mind that I have spoken a couple of hundred companies and offices and so on in front of thousands of people across the world. And I've had to, also Hannah and I wrote our autobiography, Becoming Us, where I at first was really, I don't want to put in that, I don't want to talk about that, and they said, this is the whole point. And this book came out and I was very nervous, where I speak about my childhood, where I speak about alcoholism, which was a terribly dark time, drug abuse, again, all these memories of my sort of late teens and early 20s, which are so murky and so unpleasant for me. But I know that that's what I needed to do at the time, just to kind of, I think, get by, feel numbness, call it whatever, self-medicating, or just call it, drinking too much. I was doing that because it's what I needed to do to deal with things at the time when there seemed to be no other help. It was very hard to talk about all that. My mum still hasn't read my book, and she sort of has said to me, do you want me to? And I'm kind of still a bit like, not sure I do, Mum, because it's so revealing of a terrible, terrible time in my life that I'm not particularly proud of,
Yeah, I think everyone has their coping mechanisms, and there are the typical roots of alcoholism and drug abuse, but there's a reason and there is a history of drug abuse and alcohol abuse because it numbs the pain and you want to forget. But ultimately, I imagine writing the book, and when you talk about these things, often it's like an onion, it unpeels layers of trauma that sometimes you revisit. What's your experience like with therapy then, when you have engaged in bringing this up? Because quite often I know a coping mechanism that I will deal with, issues with myself and my well-being is you'll dumb them down. But when you talk about them and you expose them, you're so emotional and it all comes out. But in a way, that's the most important thing about talking about it, getting it out there. What about for you, with your relationship with therapy, or indeed talking with family, friends and things like that? Do you find that therapeutic and exposing the trauma is actually a good thing for you?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's quite interesting because I was obviously socialized as a girl, so I'm very used to talking about my feelings because that's how I was raised. Hannah finds it a lot harder because obviously she was socialized as a boy and then went into the army where, you just didn't talk about emotions and feelings and so on. So I'm very able to talk about that. I've had years of therapy, which started off just because you have to, not you have to, but at the time when I came out as trans, I saw a psychologist anyway because it helped, but it also sort of helped to get my gender recognition certificate and so on. So I've had a lot of time to talk about, my dad, which was tough because he was my hero and then died when I was 18, and so that was all very difficult. And alcoholism, everything else, being trans, being othered, being made to feel at school like I was this freak and getting quite badly bullied, and so I'm quite used to speaking about it all. And I don't, again, writing the book, I have to say, was quite cathartic once it was all out there. And then when people message me fairly frequently and say, I've just got your book, and from all across the world, and it's really helped me, that obviously means a lot because I know I put it all out there and it's helped someone else, which was obviously why we did it. When friends have said they've read it, that always makes me a bit nervous because there's so much in there that I wouldn't necessarily want a very close friend to know every single detail. But, it's all been very helpful. One thing that's interesting, though, in terms of sort of, unleashing is crying is something I used to do a lot pre-transition. But since starting testosterone, because I have to inject myself with testosterone every 2 weeks for the rest of my life. And genuinely, when I started testosterone, I almost lost my ability to cry. There is a real chemical something that happens, and this is, a lot of trans guys have said this, that, from going from very, very freely crying and really being able to let it all out, it's very, very hard for me now to truly, I cry in an advert on television, but when I'm angry or when I'm sad, it's a lot harder to get the tears out than it used to be pre-testosterone. So there is really something to the whole boys don't cry.
Very, very interesting. Like even there, I would have never have heard that, and it's so interesting to actually hear your experiences with that. You mentioned, and please say if this is too sensitive, but this is very much a safe space, and I want to, as you know, with everything that you've done with your documentary, your book, and everything in between, talking about it is essential. But talking about your father there, you mentioned him, he was a hero figure of yours, and so he very sadly passed away at the age of 18. What would you say to him now if he saw you at your full potential, thriving, getting to meet his grandchildren? What do you think that would be like?
I would hope that he would be proud. I lost him and my grandmother, who was my world, about 2 years apart, and I would hope that they would be very proud. With my dad, it was difficult because he was my hero growing up. And then when I hit puberty and everything, the world for trans people, when puberty comes, it's usually a really, really traumatic time because obviously, your body changes in ways that really ram it home that you are different, that you're not who you feel yourself to be. It sort of feels a bit like your body's kind of betraying you. And my reaction was to become very, very angry, very, very reclusive. I just shut myself off and I became a ball of rage because I didn't understand why, at 13 years old, still no one was helping me with what I'd been, speaking about. I'd been telling my mum and dad I was a boy since I was 4 years old. And I sort of felt a bit like, why is no one helping me? And I did. I blamed him and I blamed her. And, he didn't really get it. And his reaction, much like my reaction when he's feeling rejected, was to get angry. So we had, he and I, who were both hotheads, the anger, the explosions, the arguments, it eventually became easier just not to be around each other. And then unfortunately, when he did die, fairly suddenly, he was given a year and it turned out to be 3 months from mesothelioma. Rocked my world because you're left not only bereft that your hero has died, but also with massive amounts of guilt that you've not spoken properly in however many years. I was just a kid. I was a teenager. I was already drinking a lot by then. I had a terrible weed habit as well. It was just awful. And, I blocked it all out. I blocked out the trans pain. I blocked out the pain of just being a young person growing up. I blocked out my father's illness and watching him fade away. And in doing all of that, I lost those last few years with him. And obviously those are years that you can never get back. So I would hope that, he and my grandmother both know that, I love them very much. And I hope that they are, if they are looking down on me, which I kind of like to think they are proud of the man I've become and proud of my beautiful family and my beautiful daughters.
I love that. That's beautiful. I'm going to slightly pivot to, I think, it's interesting when you think of definitions of words, but I'm curious to know what you think of this. What does the word community mean to you?
So community, I mean, certainly from a kind of LGBT perspective, we have had to, as people, marginalised people who've been discriminated against, historically had to find those communities where we know that they are safe spaces. That for me, I guess, is it. A safe space where you can be yourself, you can speak about yourself, that everything you're saying, like when I sit with other trans guys, which is fairly rare because trans guys quite often, unlike trans women, are sort of afforded the luxury of disappearing into society. So there are a lot of trans guys walking around that you wouldn't ever know were trans, which is, it's easy, it's sort of, easier for us to live that way, but harder for us to find those communities because we are all so covert. Whereas for trans women, again, historically, who've tended to be a bit taller, a bit broader, a bit more visible, they've found those communities. They've always been trans women's bars and newspapers and magazines and spaces. So, they've had those communities and they've had those feelings of safety. Whereas trans guys, it's so unusual. I remember the first time I sat with another group of trans men was probably when I was probably not until I was about 30 or 31, having transitioned at 28. And the enormous relief and joy of being able to talk about things with these guys, that it didn't feel uncomfortable, it didn't feel embarrassing, it didn't feel any of this thing, because we'd all gone through exactly the same things, talking about our top surgeries, talking about things we'd gone through, and it was just an enormous relief. And that for me, I think is community. And it's just feeling a sense of unity, feeling a sense of acceptance, unrivaled acceptance and belonging, which I'd had searched for all my life and sort of finally found, in my early 30s. And it's very powerful.
Do you think, looking back as well on the reliance on drugs and alcohol, was not only to numb things, but talking about acceptance, self-acceptance, and, not accepting within what is going on, not just yourself, but, everything in the world fighting against what is going on. Do you think that was where this reliance came on as well?
Yeah, I mean, alcohol and drugs went hand in hand. I was part of the, I came out as a lesbian when I was about 16 and threw myself into that community and was very accepted. I was taken in as what was perceived to be a butch woman. and dated a lot and made some good friends, but I always knew that it wasn't who I was supposed to be, and I almost felt like a fraud. I think that also drove me to more drink and more, because it was all sort of very much all the girls together and all the women and I felt like a fraud in the middle of that. It's almost like I was lying to all these people who'd been so accepting and so kind towards me, and so that really became my crutch. And in fact, the only reason why I was able to transition, it's sort of, again, this is why I say it all was, I guess, supposed to happen, even though I look back at a lot of it and it feels so nasty and seedy and unpleasant. It was because I nearly drank and drugged myself to death that I actually ended up in hospital at 25 with acute pancreatitis and nearly died. So there was 3 weeks of being in hospital with just the most excruciating pain. And the doctor saying, if you don't make a change, you're going to die, basically. And so a friend of mine said, why don't you come out to Manhattan for a year and just take a break? So I did. I packed a bag and went off to New York. And within the New York queer community, for the first time in my life at 25 years old, I met another transgender man. For the first time, I met another person like me at 25. Can you imagine? 2.5 decades of thinking I was the only person in the world like me. And I met this guy, and he was funny and productive and kind and so handsome and just loved by this community and loved by his parents. And he gave me hope for the first time in my life. And through him and through, obviously, coming back to the UK, coming out to my mum, who was fantastic and just said, of course, I'm going to support you. I love you. I just want you to be happy. And very quickly after that, as soon as I kind of got on the pathway towards studying testosterone and top surgery and so on, I just stopped doing drugs. I just didn't want them anymore. I didn't need them anymore. They were hindering me in every way. And I realized that it was very much a kind of getting myself through till I could be happy on my own back. And I, chucked them in pretty much overnight and have never looked back.
Wow.
Yeah, so
that's amazing.
I know, and I was doing a lot of everything at that point. And I just, I decided to write a film about my transition and kind of, use my own physical changes to show the character's changes, and shot it over 2 years. And it was this, no one had done that before. And so, we premiered at the British Film Institute, and I was like, wow, I can actually do something positive. Why do I need drugs? And that was it, I didn't. And so again, a very long, my God, there's no succinct answers with Jake Graf, you'll notice. But no, I just, for me, it got me to where I needed to be, possibly got me there alive, and then once I'd got there, it was like, goodbye, old friends.
It's really interesting from, meeting you and listening to you is every now and then in your life there have been pillars of hope who have been people. Meeting that first trans man in New York, and then meeting Hannah, and these lovely pillars. And there are friends as well that I have no doubt that are pillars like this as well. And I read something on your Instagram that was just posted at the end of last year, where it was part of a long caption, but something that stood out to me specifically, where you wrote something that said, making friends, losing friends. And I thought that was really interesting, because that is very much a part of life for absolutely everyone. But my question to you is, have there been people in your life, notably recently, who have made their decisions and based their friendship on you being trans? Or is that now very much a thing of the past?
No, that's a thing of the past. I mean, I have to say that I lost a lot of my very close, the lesbian community was my family for many years, and my transition was not taken well, put it that way.
Well, can I ask, why is that? Because again, this is coming from a place of complete ignorance. I'm genuinely curious, want to be educated and learn.
Yeah. I mean, it surprised me, I have to say, because I sort of felt, we were all kind of queer together, but at the same time, this was, I was part of a community that was sort of based around this bar in Soho, the Candy Bar, this kind of iconic lesbian bar. And I think when I came out, I sort of rocked their understanding of who I was. I'd dated a lot of these women. I'd, spent a lot of time with these women. These were my very, very close friends. We'd been through a lot together. And I think coming out, a lot of them said, why can't you just be a butch lesbian? And I said, well, because I'm not, it's not who I am. I need to be who I am. And a lot of them, I think, just felt like it was a bit of a betrayal, like I had decided to sort of jump ship. And it was a shame because, as I say, these were women that I had grown up with, you know, realistically spent nearly a decade with. And it wasn't accepted as well as it might have been. But, you know, years later, when I bumped into them again, we've sort of made our friendship again. But, you know, I think me being that different just unfortunately didn't work for that community.
For sure. You have met so many incredible people as part of your life, not just in any community, but, you know, Lorraine being such a pivotal spokesperson, someone really cool like that. But I guess a very short, simple question. Who is inspiring you right now? And it can be about anything.
Who's inspiring me right now? I think my kids always inspire me, genuinely.
Love that.
I know it's a bit naff. Considering, like, you know, they call me a poo-poo head, like, you know, most breakfasts. You know,
it's a classic.
Daddy, you're a poo-poo head. I'm like, thanks.
I'll wait till next week. See what that insult will be.
It's, they are adorable. I mean, they are, you know, I'm learning a lot. And as I said, I've always looked after kids, but they are fantastic. The second one is hilarious and, you know, really knows how to make you laugh and also screams a lot at the moment because she's 3 and, you know, she likes to scream.
What else are your hobbies?
Right?
Screaming's up there.
Screaming and dancing is basically what she does. And, you know, the eldest, we've always been very, very close and just seeing them bounce back from someone being mean to them at school. And of course, that's already started, you know, age 5. She told me she doesn't want to play with me today. She told me I'm not her friend. She told me I'm not coming to her party. So there's already that kind of I want to go in there and I want to, you know, shake it all up and tell these kids to be nice to my daughter, which obviously, you know, they're 5-year-old girls. I'm not yet. But I find them and my wife, you know, who is just phenomenal and hardworking and kind and just, you know, really just is just fantastic. So
there are amazing people outside of your beautiful family that are spokesmen and women on, you know, absolutely everything. People find their passion and are very passionate about it. But notably, when someone with a huge platform shines a light, it can be so impactful, right? And I look at, you know, Youngblood recently lending his tunes to something, you know, I know it's not him coming to, or like using his platform immediately to shout loud about it, doing 10 Instagram posts or going to talk at the United Nations or something, but it's someone using their platform for something so important is always amazing.
Yeah.
What was that like? Did you get to meet him?
I've met him a couple of times. I mean, it was great because he sort of was introduced by friends and I'd seen him at the Attitude Awards over the summer. But, you know, we have our fantastic Trans is Human.
Sorry.
That's what I meant. You all right?
Yeah, you're good.
So we've got our fantastic Trans is Human portraits, which were shot by world-renowned fashion photographer Mariana Vivanco. And we wanted to do a project that was shining a light on trans people away from their trans identities. So, you know, everyone's so bored about hearing about, well, I came out and I transitioned and this is my, you know, which I've just done for the last. But what we wanted was stories of who are you as a person beyond your transness, who are you? So we chose 13 fantastic people. We've got Amanda, who's a Ugandan refugee who now raises money, charity walks and so on for other refugees. We've got Sarah, who lost her sight at 42 and at 52 is now abseiling down buildings and running marathons to raise money for other adults with visual impairments. Petra, who's a 70-year-old grandmother. Milo, who's a 16-year-old rugby player. You know, these were just fantastic people away from the transness just happened to be. And so we got these stunning photos, beautiful interviews, and we're very, very fortunate that the project initially launched across all the Westfields in London, you know, Stratford and White City for Trans Day of Visibility back in March, 31st of March last year. Lorraine obviously had us on the show to talk all about it, which was fantastic. And they're online, obviously, and they then launched again for Trans Day of Remembrance, which is November 20th, where we remember all the trans people who've lost their lives over the last year. And Outernet, do you know Outernet in London?
No.
So Outernet, the big exhibition space outside Tottenham Court Road, you know the huge screens, interactive.
Yeah, okay, sure.
Yeah, and so they are fantastic, the couple who run that. Scott and Philip, and they are very good friends with Youngblood, Dominic. And so they said, you know, why don't we give you the space for that week running up to Trans Day of Remembrance. So we had, Hannah edited these, what was supposed to be seen on a screen, to 20-meter long, stunning, beautiful videos and portraits, and it looked fantastic. And obviously all the footfall going through there, they've got millions of people every week. And Scott and Philip asked Youngblood if he would mind giving us a track, and so he said absolutely. Feels really, really strongly about it. Has a lot of trans friends. Is obviously very much within that community. And all of a sudden we had, Hello Heaven Hello, and it was just honestly the stuff of dreams, because it's such a beautiful track. And Youngblood is so revered, and obviously it was the year he was, I think, 5 Grammy nominations. Yeah. So no, it was fantastic. And when someone does that, we've had so much support from people like Lorraine, huge platform, Gokwan, huge platform. There are so many people that have given us incredible support. And when I say us, what I mean is the trans community. It is just vital that we have those voices, because the newspapers are certainly not playing ball. Yeah,
I totally get it. Now, I'm conscious of time, but a couple of other bits that I still want to touch on.
I'll try and be short this time. I'll go short.
Notably, growing up, for anybody, there is absolutely no blueprint or script. You'll see what I'm doing here. Nice transition. But specifically talking about stories on screen, and in books and through storytelling of people online, there is now so much more variety, I'd like to think, to what was happening 80s, 90s and beyond. Do you feel a responsibility on your shoulders to tell your stories, and indeed trans stories, through film?
Absolutely. When I grew up, there was nothing out there at all. And, even when I started making films, which was now probably 14 years ago, there was nothing for trans men. So this is why I think, my first film, which was made for about 200 quid on a dodgy old VHS camera, a lot of it's out of focus. But because it was showing my transition from sort of looking very much like a lesbian, short hair and very, girly, to a man with a beard and, a deeper voice and broader shoulders. And people had never seen that before. And so it was really embraced by film festivals. Obviously launching at the BFI didn't hurt. But it really kind of spurred me on. When that film, I put it out online, thinking, no one's going to watch this. I stuck it out on YouTube, and I began very quickly getting messages from young trans guys in places like Afghanistan and Russia and Poland, where they had never seen another trans man, and saying, my God, you are my story. You've made me realize that I'm not alone. There's nothing wrong with me, and that one day I too could be happy like you, and one day I could be the man reading those messages, and they were coming thick and fast, and I thought, that's amazing that one little 17-minute, 200 quid film has made such a difference to so many people. And so I just kept on writing. I've written about older trans people, I've written about trans kids, I've written about trans women, I've written about non-binary characters. And those films have toured the world. And, everywhere I have been within trans spaces, someone has come up and said, you changed my life with one of your films. And that, to me, is why we tell those stories, why we share those stories. And more so, if I can show them to a cis audience, that don't have much of a point of reference when it comes to trans stories, great, because it opens their hearts and minds as well. So, that to me is vital.
What is your biggest criticism of the film and TV industry right now when it comes to representation?
I think very sadly, the last, 5 years ago, we were seeing a lot more trans representation. There were characters on EastEnders, there were characters on Hollyoaks. I think there are still a few out there. There's obviously Matty, who has been on Emmerdale for Ash Palmisiano, who's been on Emmerdale now for years, which is great. But, I could literally name maybe 2 or 3. And we are not seeing the representation we were a few years ago. I think, do you know GLAAD? GLAAD in the US, the gay and lesbian something, but they basically monitor queer representation in media, and they actually reported at the beginning of the year that they have seen a 41% drop in LGBT representation across all film and TV series and so on, which obviously is very worrying. People are becoming nervous when the world turns, and when you've got a lot of big, powerful countries and administrations who are saying that DEI no longer matters. In fact, not only does it not matter, but we don't want to see it. We don't want to see that representation. We don't want to see woke. Obviously, studios making those programs and putting out that content also get very nervous. That's, a given. So I think people are playing much more safely. People are being much more cautious. Obviously, Heated Rivalry, I don't know if you've seen, fantastic. I'm amazed it got made. It is just, given the climate we're living in, the fact that got made and the fact that has been such a huge success, I think is fantastic. I loved it, finished it a couple of nights ago. I really hope they get a second season. I can't imagine they won't. But when you see how little representation there is out there, it is so important that we are all, as LGBT creatives, striving to really put as much out there, because, you know, if you're a young person growing up, now that Heartstopper's all but stopped, and Heartstopper was such a huge
Massive.
cultural seismic event for these young people, you know, and even the older generation. I know old gay guys who are watching it and saying, if I'd had this when I was young, it would have saved my life.
Yeah.
And, you know, you're seeing all this, and then that's ended. There's a film coming out in July, directed by my very good friend Wash Westmoreland. But after that, where did these young people look?
Yeah, it's you've got to make it.
On my shoulders.
Yeah.
All right, mate.
Very niche here. If you can work with any actor or director, I'll tell you what, alive or dead as well. I'll give you that, but I don't know if anyone may have got. Who would you want to work with, and why? Any on any project. Who's a bucket list talent that you would like to work with?
Wow, talk about on the spot.
Yeah, that's tough.
I mean, honestly, and I know I've just said Wash Westmoreland. So Wash is a very good friend and directed me on Colette with Keira Knightley, and it's just he's a fantastic. He also did Earthquake Bird for Netflix, and obviously Heartstopper, which we are yet to see. But you know, he is an incredibly talented, patient, fantastic director. In fact, I'm missing like his biggest. Still Alice, so he directed Still Alice with Julianne Moore, which obviously was Oscar nominated, and I think she won the Oscar for that. So he directed that, and he is just a phenomenal talent. I've seen him on set on Heartstopper, and he was just so patient with these young people, so great. He was great with me, he was great with everyone on set. He is just the most chilled, relaxed. And I think we, as an actor, you will also know, you know, you can be on set with some really angry, quite intimidating directors. There's just no need for it. You know, as an actor, you want someone who makes you feel calm and supported, and like they just want to help you get to your best point. And Wash is certainly that man. So
Love
you know,
that.
all I would say is Heartstopper coming out in July. Go and check it out.
Absolutely. Penultimate question. If someone listening is really struggling right now with their identity, their mental health, anything in between, what would you say to them? What's your message?
I would say that there's lots of help out there, that there are a lot of us out there now, that we are, you know, are we speaking specifically sort of trans or LGBT or just generally?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think people who are feeling marginalised in the trans community, who are feeling alone, isolated, not sure where to turn to. Yes, there's always forums and these communities of offering for support and help, but what's your kind of piece of advice to them to get them through that really dark, difficult moment? Yeah,
I mean, what I would say, yes, you're absolutely right. There are the forums. I would say, you know, in real life, IRL networks and communities are much more important than, you know, but again, I know for a lot of people, if you're stuck in the Outer Hebrides and you're that queer trans person, you know, that online community can, again, be life-saving. But I would just say, you know, try and remember that we are more numerous than ever before. And that's not because of any sort of trend or fad. That is because the more visibility there is, just like in the gay rights movement in the 80s, the more queer and gay people saw other queer and gay people, the easier it is to come out. And it's never easy, but the more of us there are, the more we should feel empowered, the more we should feel safe, the more we should feel we've got those communities. You know, there are more and more of us, and you will find your tribe and you will find your people. And, you know, honestly, I know it's tough. Have heart and have faith, because, you know, I never thought that I'd get there. I never thought that I would be where I'm now, married to a beautiful woman with beautiful kids and supported. But, you know, I went through some really dark times and I got through. So just, you know, don't give up, and know that whilst things are dark now, you know, it is always darkest before dawn.
I actually have one more question before my final question. Okay. Sorry, but I think it's even more important to highlight this. What would be something you would say to somebody who doesn't know enough about the trans community? What is something that you can say, or a place to go look, somewhere to educate themselves and to open their mind and be educated and be part of something that's so important?
There are loads of websites and so on. You know, the Stonewall website is great. Yeah. I'm actually a trustee at Stonewall, so I think they're great. Stonewall's great. Transactual is another website which is very good and very informative. I think if you just Google, you know, trans information, you know, you're going to get a lot out there. But as I say, Stonewall, Transactional, great. I think Gendered Intelligence puts out some stuff as well, Gendered Intelligence. So, there is a lot of information out there, and I would just try and remember that all the information you are getting is from a media that is not supportive of us, and for a media that really, I don't think even that, that they are, all these journalists are necessarily trans hostile or unsupportive. I think they know that we're clickbait, and I think they know that we sell newspapers. And that's the saddest thing of it. A lot of these people, when I meet them and I say, but why did you write that? Well, because they know it's selling the papers. They know there is this really odd fascination around trans people, obsession around trans people, and that people will eat it up. So just remember that we are people, that we are humans, that we are honestly mostly just trying to live our lives quietly. Please don't assume that you know about us. Ask questions, because most trans people literally are just the same as you or I. They've just had to go through that extra step to be the people that they knew themselves to be.
Final question. What does the word headstrong mean to you?
Headstrong to me, I think, is, you can be afraid, you can deal with the tough stuff. You know that it is difficult out there. You know that you can struggle. Just kind of getting through another day, knowing that, like I said earlier, it can be darkest before dawn. It's always going to get light again. I think you need to just, I don't want to say keep pushing on, because it sounds so arduous, and no one should have to keep pushing on. But just remember, that there is so much out there that's good. There is so much out there to be grateful for. There will always be another day. So just, I'd say it's very British. Keep your chin up, and just remember that there is support and there is care out there, and just stay as strong as you can. But allow yourself, if you need to have a day watching TV and eating Nando's, that's okay.
Jake, thank you so much for coming in. I'm so happy we finally got to do it, and I absolutely loved meeting you. Really enjoyed our conversation. We could talk forever. It is fantastic.
I can talk forever, clearly.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, mate.
Nice.